Olam chesed yibana, yanarai, narai, narai. Olam chesed yibana, yanarai, narai, narai. Olam chesed yibana, yanarai, narai, narai. Olam chesed yibana, yanarai, narai, narai.
Rosh Hashanah is traditionally for one thing, sounding the shofar. The Torah simply refers to today as Yom Teruah, the day of blowing the shofar. Today, more than any other day of the year, we need to assess our souls and take a moral inventory of the life we are living and not the life we would like to be leading. Throughout this sermon, we will hear the shofar. It has 3 notes, Tekiyah, Shivarim, and Teruah, and it concludes with one long Tekiyah, Tekiyah Gedolah. Each blast of the shofar is calling on us, is taking us to task and demanding a change in spirit, a shift towards empathy and away from judgment, challenging us to resist the instinct to speak first and compelling us towards the divinity of listening. Each of us need to hear its loud and unambiguous call, allow it to penetrate our ears, open our eyes, and I ask that you embolden yourself to open your heart in ways you have not done so before. But this year, not for your own sake, not just to be a better version of yourself, but how we, collectively, as a community, can live up to our name, Rodfei Tzedek. The note we just heard was the Tekiyah. And let me pause to point out that the commandment is not to blow the shofar. The mitzvah is only fulfilled when we hear it. The Tekiyah is one long, strong blast. And the word Tekiyah means rootedness. Yet the point of the shofar is the opposite. In this year, more than any other year in memory, we need to be shaken from our positions and places of comfort in order to be moved and roused from the moral slumber we have been in. The shofar is our instrument of change. Its sounds set the curriculum for our moral and spiritual course of action. And we use the shofar because the ram's horn recalls the binding of Isaac. And when we hear the shofar, a part of us is brought to that mountaintop, the place that God, Abraham, and Isaac met. But when we are there and along the way, are we choosing only to hear the sounds of that story, of our stories that work for us? Yesterday, we read the story that got us to the foot of the mountain, the story of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar, and their sons, Isaac and Ishmael. Many of us spend a great deal of time being disturbed by the binding of Isaac, and I think that causes us to overlook the troubling story of Hagar. It is the story of someone who has been moved to the background, othered enough that we are okay with her status as a pawn, as a character in the service of others in our larger narrative. But let us take a moment to examine this story and simultaneously think if this story sounds at all familiar. Sarah cannot get pregnant, so she gives Hagar, her maidservant, to Abraham. This transaction or gift enables them to be parents, but more importantly, to have an heir and merit the many blessings God has promised their progeny. Yes, I know, we need to be careful. I must tread lightly when I apply the moral standards of today to the ancient Near East. This practice of taking a servant and seeing them not as fully human, but as a receptacle for material gain, was clearly fully accepted at the time. And this is the Torah we're talking about, and we are Jews, followers of the same tradition that codified the rabbis for condemning Abraham for not saying to God, "No, I will not sacrifice my son." I wish we had more voices doing that here for Hagar. As we move forward in the story, Hagar and Ishmael, the son she had with Abraham, have worn out their welcome, and the Torah makes it clear that Ishmael may no longer play with his half-brother Isaac. Sarah demands that Abraham drive this woman out of their home and out of their lives so that they will no longer be seen. Abraham, without hesitation, agrees. He gives Hagar a skin of water and sends her out into the desert. Hagar, alone in the vast desert, is alone with her son, and she is hopeless. Up until that moment, like the Israelites who will fail and falter in the wilderness, she has never been free, and she is completely without the resources to succeed, let alone survive. When she runs out of water, she puts her son under a tree and walks away and says, "Let me not look on as the child dies." And sitting at a distance, she burst into tears. But God heard that cry and called out to Hagar, "Open your eyes." And when she did, a well appeared. It is a powerful moment, yet all too often, life does not fit that script. While the Rosh Hashanah liturgy is about hearing, this first Torah reading is signaling to us that it is about training our gaze beyond the comfortable view of our telling of our stories. Before we can hear, we must be willing to see. If it wasn't clear what I was trying to do before, I imagine it is now. This is a sermon about racism. And as difficult and as uncomfortable as it may be to hear, we must acknowledge a corollary of that, which is white privilege, the privilege that so many in our community have greatly benefited from. But let me pause to be abundantly clear. Not everyone in our community is white, and not all Jews are white. I know not all Jews of European descent see themselves as white. Maybe we pause when filling out a form that asks for our race. That has evolved, and I know that seeing my Judaism and my whiteness as distinct is a privilege, because my place in this country is far more secure than it has been for my parents, and much more so than it had been for my grandparents. And how I identify and what box I check off on that form that asks for my race is not determined by a neo-Nazi or a white supremacist. It is determined by the police officer who greets me on the street and by centuries of law that has seen me and my fellow Jews of European descent as white. We have thousands of years of oppression and struggle. And that struggle, while deep, painful, and filled with sadness that tragically is not going away, has not been because of the color of our skin. While we or our families might have come to this country for a first taste of true emancipation, something that had been elusive in Russia or in Germany, whether we came through Ellis Island or Galveston, we came free. Black children do not get to dress up like their ancestors on Immigration Day, recalling that momentous moment their ancestors saw Lady Liberty for the first time. Africans were brought to this country in chains as subhuman cargo, as retainers of potential for material benefit. Their worth was what they could give to their enslaver, which has, without question, built this country into the behemoth it is now. The enslaved had no agency, and they were stripped of their stories. Even in the sparsely detailed Torah, we know Abraham and Sarah's parents' name. We know the name of their homeland. We see the full progression of their destiny, and we get to see all of their failures and successes. But what do we know about Hagar? What about her story do we identify with beyond the service she provides to our narrative? This reading of the story This story that sets the stage for the Akedah in Israelite and Jewish history moving forward should unsettle us because it's the literal read. This is not the midrash of a progressive rabbi, and there are no convenient omissions here. This story should reveal to us the cracks in our identity, the cracks we created but shielded ourselves from, and the wrongs that have been perpetuated, most likely not by us. Yet we avoid seeing. We obscure our community's view, not wanting to disturb our centered and rooted places of comfort. We just heard each of the three wavering notes of the Shofar Blast. Shevarim means broken. One traditional understanding of this note is that we should hear it as the weeping, moaning sounds of the brokenhearted. Has there ever been a time where each of us needs to hear the stunted notes, calling our attention to the brokenness that has characterized the plight of so many who live so near, yet in reality live so far away? This sound is here to be a cry for mercy. And we invoke Isaac's sacrifice as we imagine ourselves standing at our own trial on Rosh Hashanah. Has there ever been a more appropriate time to hear, to embody, and God willing, internalize the broken moans of our country? And do we have the courage to hear the verdict? The Akedah, the binding of Isaac, has been on my mind all summer because it was what I saw as I watched as George Floyd was being killed. I saw in him someone like Isaac, who was not a young boy, yet was powerless to the forces that acted upon him. But unlike Isaac, he was not saved. There was no well to splash George Floyd with Mayim Chaim, the waters of life, as there had been for Ishmael. There was no angel to dislodge the force of his killer's knee, nor was there a ram caught in the thicket whose moral force compelled someone, anyone, to step forward and to step up. On that day, we did not just see a man being killed. We did not only witness the gross inequality of police violence and the tragic toll that over-policing has had on Black and brown communities. We were not only seeing a disastrous example of systemic racism and the poverty that is the offspring of that system. We saw all of those things because they were there. Yet we cannot allow ourselves to turn away from the discomfort, as you may have, as I undoubtedly have in the past. As Jews, we needed to see in that video the erasure of the divine image. We have no more important message, no theology more essential than the idea that we are all made in the imprint of God. You and me, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. That day, God was diminished. George Floyd saying, "I can't breathe," was telling each of us that our comfortable, rooted lives need to be uprooted because the lives of our neighbor, partner, colleague, friend, patient have been broken. And now we must acknowledge that our lives have been broken too. The truah also is a broken sound, but the word means alarm. For some, the shofar blast of racism went off a long time ago, and for some, only now we can hear the tragedy of deafening silence. Moments ago, I reminded us of the first statement in the Torah, that we are all built in the divine image. But do you know what the first question in the Torah was? Where are you? The truah blast is demanding an answer. I'm sure that for many, George Floyd's death and the protests that followed were more of the same. A stark reminder, as Jacob Blake's sister recently pointed out, of America's brokenness, of its failure to live up to its grand vision of itself. Or maybe all you heard was noise. But I know that I am not alone in seeing that video as a wake-up call. Alarms do not work if they go off early. We press snooze, continually putting off whatever essential task required setting the alarm in the first place. But if we set the alarm too late, we will miss what we needed to do. We will miss the point of that alarm. Eric Garner's last words were also, "I can't breathe." And while I marched for justice for him, his name and his voice and the alarm it sounded, at least for me, receded off into the distance. But you cannot hear an alarm for 8 minutes and 46 seconds and press snooze. Nor could you hear the searing and painful broken moans of that alarm and still feel rooted. We poorly translate our synagogue's name, Rodfei Tzedek, as pursuers of justice. Tzedek is a word, as far as I can tell, originated in the marketplace and was applied when all weights and measures were equal. Tzedek is about pursuing a just freedom, one that is equitable and equally dispersed. That is what we must pursue, a world where schooling and equality are equally available, where food, housing, and safety are equally dispersed. And while this is, without question, enacted through legislation, it must begin with affecting and then changing hearts and minds. I believe with all of my being that changing hearts and minds is a crucial and impactful first step. But if we are going to truly earn our name, which is, as our very own Hal Weitzman pointed out, an active name, we need a plan. In the days that followed George Floyd's death, and as the protests subsided, we were left wondering, what can we do? How can I solve this intractable problem, one that is older than our nation? How can I cure this disease, a lone person who, most likely, has purposefully done slim to nothing to further its spread? For starters, we don't. We are not responsible for ending, as many people have called it, the pandemic of racism. But we can do our small part. Go to neighborhoods you do not usually go to. Find ways to have meaningful interactions and relationships with people of color. Think about what you have that is valuable, whether it be knowledge, time, or networks. And give money. We are often uncomfortable with this idea, but this is something in general that we have and many communities of color do not. And it is something that can make a direct impact, and it is necessary if we really care about tzedek. Give a monthly donation to an organization or institution that is anti-racist, that is uplifting communities that have been burdened by racism and suppressed through racist legislation. Join our social action committee and think how we can actively and thoughtfully engage with our neighbors here on the South Side, and how we can give money, how we can make justice something that is also pursued through a line item on our budget. Join us through care and humility. Help us to find the streets to stand in and the books to read. Help us to learn the Torah we need to know and guide us on the Torah we need to live. In Judaism, brokenness is generative. At a wedding, we do not say, "You may kiss the bride." We say, "Break the glass." We ask the couple to leave the perfect wholeness of the chuppah, of the wedding canopy, and enter a reality that is the opposite. The shattering of the glass signals the couple's essential task of being an active part of healing a broken world, of being a tiny shard of hope and purpose. I am not calling myself a racist, nor should anyone out there hear me calling them one. That does nothing and is actually far more destructive. What I am asking is that we join hands, leave the comfort of our lives, and step beyond it, and begin to pick up the debris of brokenness that you may have never felt personally. But today, of all days, that alibi will no longer play. The world was born on Rosh Hashanah, and by honoring this birthday, commemorating creation, we are being called upon to envision a better world. But rather than celebrate and sing, we blow the shofar. We all need to hear something different, because we all need to end in a different place. But may we all be on the same path, one that is rough but widening. May we all hear the shofar shake our skeletons from head to toe. May this year's shofar see our brokenness, hear our yearning for wholeness, and may it circumcise our hearts.